This is my 2016 R1200R. It's got 56,000 miles on it, and about a year and a half ago, at about 30,000 miles, the drive shaft failed. I am not sure exactly why, but I suspect this played a part in it. You see that rubber boot is not seated properly into the swing arm housing, and I suspect water and air got in there and allowed that to dry out and fail prematurely. At any rate, I was tooling down the highway at a pretty good clip when the bike started to shake violently and put me off the road. This is the front end, or the engine end, of the drive shaft there. So I replaced the drive shaft, but that was something I had never done before, and I had my hands full just figuring out how to do it. So I didn't make a video, which I regretted later. And then about a month ago, I started hearing a clanking noise coming from somewhere at the rear end, and I didn't know what it was. I took it by the BMW dealership, and the mechanic took a look at it. He said he wasn't sure exactly what it was either, but when he looked behind the boots, he said, "You need more grease in there." He said what he would do is take it all apart, clean it real good, grease it up with real high quality grease, and put it all back together and see if the sound didn't go away. So that's what I did, and this time I made the video. So let's get started. I'm going to remove the drive shaft, clean it real good, lube it up real good, and put it all back together. We'll start here. You got to drop down the rear drive assembly. That's easy to do. Remove that bolt right there and rotate it back. It's kind of heavy, so be ready for it to drop. Next, we've got to remove the drive shaft from the main power shaft coming out of the engine. I tried first with a crowbar to get that thing off, and ultimately succeeded using a simple screwdriver. There's a ring inside that drive shaft that snaps over a groove on the main shaft coming out of the engine. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more here in just a minute. I wanted to say a few words about the snap ring, or the circle clip you see there, part number 2, that helps hold that drive shaft onto the output shaft from the transmission. That snap ring fits inside that drive shaft about where you see the dotted line I've got drawn on there with the arrow. And when you slide that shaft onto the output shaft from the transmission, it snaps onto a groove right where you see that blue arrow pointing on the end of the output shaft. When my drive shaft failed, I bought replacement parts. I bought a replacement drive shaft, and I bought a replacement snap ring. What I didn't know is that the replacement drive shaft already had a snap ring installed in it. So in effect, I bought a spare snap ring. Well, I didn't know that, and I spent the better part of an afternoon trying to figure out how in the world do I put this thing together. That's a factory press fit, and I was quite frustrated until finally I saw inside there it's already got one in it. So I would have saved a lot of time, and maybe it'll save you a little bit of time if you're aware that if you buy part 1, you might want to buy a spare part 2 like I did, just in case things change. But part 1 comes with part 2 already installed. So now that we've got the drive shaft out, the next step is to clean everything thoroughly. I used brake cleaner and a toothbrush, and you'll see a wire brush here as well. The wire brush I used is normally used for polishing copper fittings that are going to be soldered, but it worked pretty well for this application. You can see the snap ring inside there at the end of the splines. This is the grease I finally settled on using. I spent some time studying up on greases and trying to find what the best thing would be. And there seemed to be a general consensus out there that molybdenum disulfide was best for splines and universal joints, and that's what I went with. This stuff has 3%. Some of the things I read suggested that much higher percentages are out there, but I couldn't verify that was the case or not. So if you have information on what the best grease for this application would be, I'd certainly love to hear from you. Like a lot of jobs I do, I started out kind of gently and refined, and by the time I was done, I was slathering that stuff on there pretty good. This stuff was inexpensive. I think I spent $6 for that tube. Some of the stuff for similar size tubes were like $23. There was some Honda M77 I looked at that was $26 for a 2-ounce, little teeny 2-ounce tube. Next, I cleaned the output shaft from the transmission, the splines on that output shaft. You can't quite see that little groove I was talking about. It's just out of view there. But I use the same technique, a toothbrush, brake fluid, or brake cleaner, and a wire brush. I also used, when I was done, I used paper towels to soak up as much of that brake fluid as I could, and then I used air. I had an air nozzle and blew compressed air in there pretty thoroughly and waited a little while and did it a couple times to make sure that I got every last little bit of that brake cleaner dried up and out of there. At this point, I checked to see if there was any play in that rear end, in that rear drive, and I think there is. So I'm not sure this lube job is going to be sufficient to solve my problem. So everything's thoroughly cleaned, thoroughly lubricated with a good grease. We're ready to reinstall that drive shaft. This step, while simple in concept, was pretty daggone difficult. That drive shaft's pretty heavy, and you got to get it to lift up with one hand from a distance like that. And when the U-joints tend to flop around and fight you. When you finally get it just right, then the splines aren't lined up, and there's no secret, no magic. It's just a pain. I almost got it here, and in just a second you're going to hear it go thunk and slide up onto that spline. There. Now we've got to get that snap ring to snap over the groove on the drive shaft. It's not seated yet, so it took a little effort there too, but when you'll see here in a second, it'll snap onto there pretty distinctly. So we're about ready for the final assembly. We'll grease up and reinstall the boot, the protective boot, and slide the rear end into place and be ready to get on the road. I got the reinstallation bolt there ready, put a little Loctite on it before I put the rear drive assembly in place. And that's because, as you'll see here in a second, you only have one hand available, so it's good to have that thing where you can reach it. And I learned this trick here using a string from someone else on YouTube, so that worked beautifully. And we're about done. I've ridden the bike about 50 miles since I made the repair. I think it's too soon to tell. That clanking noise it was making wasn't real. I didn't hear it, so maybe we're good, but I've still got some testing to do. Thank you for watching. I hope it was helpful.